Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix / TC Ricks. This is a series of short stories that I'm doing that I'm calling Swamp Castle that I wrote in the early part of my career, that at one point I submitted for publication. They're okay. They're pretty good. None of them got published. I'm reading them and then offering commentary on what I think does or doesn't work on the story. And we'll see from there. This story is called Long Time Passing by Rhombus Tix. Time was long on the beacon. It wasn't like it was it wasn't like it was in the old days. People placed value in different things. No one died anymore, and the nanites could make just about anything anyone could ever want. If getting enough money to marry the one I loved meant being 12 light years away from another human being, then that is what I would do, even if I had to take 1,000 years to do it. 1,024.41 to be exact. I started at the beacon the same way I always did. I was alone. I had taken this assignment because I needed money and status. I had learned a great deal, of course, but knowledge was the kind of thing that anyone could acquire if they were willing to take the time or spend the money. I had time, just like anyone did, but no money. 1,000 years later. Please sign in at the door, the attendant in front of her house said. I was a rich man now, quite rich, due to some of the crazier things I'd done. I could afford to have him fired. He wouldn't like it at all. I was patient, despite having every reason not to. I signed at the door. 1,000 years ago. Left foot forward for the 975th time. Right foot forward for the 976th time. Turn at the corner. Start the count over again. So far, my faithful maintenance check was secure. There was nothing wrong with the mechanics of the station. Again. The thing that immortality changed the most was the value of life. Life had always been valuable, even in the old days. Murder had been wrong, but they had taken that principle and extended it to the point that no one wanted to risk their life anymore. Not when you could live forever. It was one thing to lose a few decades, but another thing entirely to lose thousands of years. We had the technology to make ships go up to half the speed of light, but they were risky and dangerous by the new standards, of course. There were always those willing to take risks in any society, the malcontents, the rebels, the visionaries, and the criminals. The colonies had been established over 3,000 years ago, but someone had to man the beacons. 1,000 years later. Please use the green pen, sir, not the yellow one. The attendant spoke with such sadness in his voice, I almost thought for a moment I'd run over his puppy. Excuse me? The green pen is for guests only. The yellow pen is used by city workers. If you use the yellow pen, then the administrator might get confused and send workers for no particular reason whatsoever. Right. Thank you, sir. 1,000 years ago. Adjusting the solar panels approximately 0.000075 degrees. Adjust the internal transmitter stabilizer approximately 4 bars on the transmission band. Move the solar panels to their original position, but ensure that they do not exceed acceptable parameters. What could be more dangerous than running a beacon? The beacons were light years away from any human traffic. The replacement usually worked very hard to ensure that they arrived on time and left the ship in good enough condition for their future passenger to get home. What went around came around, and if they caused sufficient problems, they might extend the length of time for sending the replacement. Her name was Jeru. She was from old money, very old money. Her parents had been rich since the beginning of time, it seemed, though the rational part of my mind knew that this was only an illusion, and that it had in fact been a dynasty started in the early 20th century. Of course, Given that they had been rich 300 years before the discovery of immortality and 500 years before the discovery of molecular nanetics indicated to the casual observer that it might as well have been the beginning of time. My best friend, Finney, said as much. "She's too good for you," he said. "You don't have enough money for the likes of her." Of course, he was right. I was just like any other schmo who lived at baseline. I had tried to be an artist, but all that I could ever master was technique, not spark. Anyone could do technique. It was just a matter of patience and applying the right ship. So I volunteered to join the Beacon. You would think on the surface that there would be more people interested in it, but despite the massive changes in our culture, and despite the advances in psychology that let us cure any kind of insanity, people simply did not relish the idea of spending 1,000 years away from all human contact. I didn't either. 1,000 years later. "I'm sorry, sir, but you have to put your full name on the entry form." I did put my full name on the entry form. "No, you put Elijah J. Marshall." "That is my full name." "No, your background file clearly says it is Elijah Jonathan Marshall." "You're telling me?" "Yes." "Fine. Anything else?" "No." "Thank you," I said. "Glad to be of service." He put the pen back into its holder and bowed politely. 1,000 years ago. Do not sleep more than 5.7 hours in a single day. Do not miss more than 75.42 of daily maintenance tasks except on government-sanctioned holidays, in which 47.5% of daily maintenance tasks are acceptable. Birthdays and religious holidays are not acceptable government substitutes. It had not been just a summer love. This was not even a normal, lifelong love. Most serious relationships, at least those at the deepest level that they used to be, only lasted a few centuries. And those were the exceptions. There were a few cases where a relationship would last 500 years or so, but those were actually viewed by the majority of society as unhealthy. On the other hand, it was perfectly acceptable for someone to switch between 2 or 3 partners. And in the initial days of immortality, there had been no durability whatsoever. People believed that since they were immortal and that medical science could fix almost anything, then they no longer needed to fear death. It took at least 1,000 years for advanced culture construction to reach its heyday. Insanity up to that point was only fixable by medication or surgical brain alteration. Towards the end, over 90% of the population received some form of surgical alteration or another. 1,000 years later. Giroux looked at me awkwardly from across the room. We had met when she was 18. I had been 19. We were quasi-adults, but weren't considered full citizens until we were at least 100 years old. Now she and I were both over 1,000. She looked like she had matured quite a lot more than I. Not physically, of course. Physically, she was just as radiant at the moment I first saw her. But time had made her a whole person. All I had to my life was beacon work and a candle flicker that had come before it. "I got your letters," she said patiently. "Good," I replied. I wasn't sure what to say. Obviously, she wasn't either. Neither of us were. We just sat there in silence. Finally, I just smiled. Amazingly, she smiled back. 1,000 years ago. Employees are permitted to write 1 letter each month. All other data is reserved for corporate and government needs. Circumventing these parameters will result in a fine of 9 years' pay. The second violation of circumventing these parameters will result in termination. Employee may receive as much as their relatives are willing to pay for. Repetition was the gospel of living forever. Sure, there was an infinite variety thing, and we did that, but it took about 1% of the effort that it ever had. Tiny amounts of trace elements make up your bodywork. Tiny amounts of variety in a sea of time keep you sane. You spend the vast majority of your time doing the same thing over and over. There are some who say that the times of death are preferable, since their lives actually meant something. Personally, after 20 years on the Beacon, I was inclined to agree with them. It didn't really matter. Since life was infinitely sacred and valuable, the idea that someone was unwilling to do what it took to be immortal was criminally insane. The government could cure all kinds of insanity. In this case, they simply strengthened the part of the mind that all creatures had within them, their animal survival instinct. When their fear of death increased to the point that the idea of dying terrified them more than anything else, They were more than willing to let the procedure be performed on them, and to perform whatever protocols were required. The government justified this by explaining that almost every government in history had outlawed suicide. There were many of them who found a more novel solution. Hibernation had been used quite extensively in the early colonization attempts, but was not used so much anymore. There was another reason the ships were slower than they could be. They all had to be big enough to keep everyone awake for the entire duration of the journey. So while suicide was illegal, time traveling to the future was not. Most of these poor souls simply entered hibernation chambers designed to keep them asleep for 10,000 years, in the hopes that the government would have been deposed or changed its mind by then. Not me. I was in love. I was going to stick it out. The thought might make one ask, what made me think I'm so special? Who is this girl who is worth waiting 1,000 years for? How could it be worth all of it? Didn't you ever regret making your decision? All good questions, but you have to understand. I knew what I wanted, and I was going to do anything it took to get it. 1,000 years later. Your time is up, sir. You're going to have to leave now. I haven't even had 5 minutes, I shouted in annoyance. There are many other people waiting in line, the scheduler said patiently. Derues shrugged and smiled patiently. This was a warm smile of the kind that one might give a lost child who had asked you for directions. This was hardly the person who had been writing for 1,000 years. This woman was alien to me. I understood that relationships in the flesh were often awkward compared to those in shadow realms or by correspondence. Ours had been the correspondence of antiquity, purely by the written word alone, with no visual medium of any kind. I didn't know what to say. This was the woman I had lived my life for, had endured a solitude that no man living could understand, and after only 5 minutes it was gone? What was I going to do? Please leave, sir, the scheduler said, and so I did, 1,000 years ago. My dearest Elijah, please understand that I had no choice in my father's wishes. Until I reach my 100th birthday, he has considerable say in my financial affairs. Economically, he could ruin me. He could do a lot worse. Without the proper resources to defend myself, he could arrange for governmental surgery or reprogramming. I love you. I cannot say why I love you. There is no rationality to it, but there it is. I would have waited for you. Why did you go away? It is the one place that even our family's resources cannot go. The risk of life is simply too great. Had you simply chosen to go to another star, I gladly would have followed you. But what am I to do now? It is as if you were dead. Love, Giroux. I read the letter with something of astonishment. How could this have happened? I didn't even think she knew I was alive, much less that she was interested in me. I wrote back. Dear Giroux, I met you in the rain outside your father's house. You were sneaking outside and asked to borrow my coat. I saw your face and never felt the same again. It is said that the first love is often your only love. There are others who say that the heart must be broken and mended time and time again before it is ready to find the one for whom it is meant. I don't know, nor do I care. What I do know is that the world changed for me to the moment I met you, and I will settle for nothing less until I can be with you forever. I tried everything I could to find you, but once I learned who you were, I was devastated. How could I court someone so rich? Please understand that I did not even let that stop me. I did try writing you. My letters never got through, or if they did, your replies did not. I even tried sneaking inside once, but your father's henchmen found me and tortured me. Nothing physical, of course, but the interface made it feel just as real as if they were rending my flesh. What is done is done. The truth is that I still love you, and I planned to get enough money to court you. This was the only way I could see. We can at least write, albeit once a month only. The company is rather strict about personal use of the comm. They also state that it is better for my mental health to minimize contact. I love you, EJ. 1,000 years later. I didn't know what to do. How could it have happened? What did I do that would cause her to behave in such a fashion? Our letters had grown more and more intimate over the last century. I had come to be her only true friend. She would confide things in me that she would trust with no one else. Since we were permitted only one letter, I made it a good long one each time. I told her all about myself and my duties on the station. Needless to say, after a while, we were pretty much only talking about her life. Interested things tended only to happen on the station, only about once every 100 years ago or so, usually when something went wrong with one of the ships. The more I thought about it, the more I suppose that it had to be that she had built up this image in her mind of who I was and could not possibly compare it to. I was the secret friend that no one else knew about, and that could not possibly betray her secrets. I had been the one who had been there when all other relationships failed. After all, what else did I have but her? A bitterness rose up in me, and I had to fight with every ounce of my being to push it down. The sanity monitors were very sophisticated, and if they knew what I was thinking, they would surgically alter me. A part of me was willing to accept this as an alternative to the pain I was feeling, but I had never believed in living life by proxy, and I was not going to start now. What options did I really have? I could live with the pain that I had wasted the first 1,000 years of my life, something I would never get back again, or that I could try and forget. I could go off-world. It was tempting. There was a lot more to see out there than there was on Earth, but I'd had my fill of space. I might leave in a century or two, but there was plenty that I had missed in the meantime. All of the plays, parks, and monuments constructed while I'd been away. Of course, the downside was that it would remind me of Giroux. Everything was going to remind me of Giroux. Everything. What was I supposed to do? It was at that moment I came to the realization of my best course of action. I would go into hibernation. While I felt like ending things, the truth was that it would allow me to enter a new world. As static as things were, they did change, and 1,000 years was still a long time. Giroux would still be alive, but I would not constantly be reminded of everything she and I had talked about for 1,000 years. I made the decision just as easily as I had made the one to man the beacon. I think the thing that amazed me about the building was how simple it looked. It wasn't imposing at all. I might have mistaken it for any other office building, really. There was a small coffin-shaped icon on the front of the building. Not that there was anyone that couldn't read these days. If you didn't learn, the government just implanted the right chips. The guy in the office chair swiveled back and forth while I was in the grid playing a game. I could tell by his erratic movements he was clearly involved in a major fight. I was well within my rights to notify him of my presence, but I wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere, and I didn't want to annoy people who would be watching over my corpse for 1,000 years. Apparently, I had some sense of self-preservation after all. 10 years ago. It was the last day of my confinement. It had been a very long haul. I thought I had understood the meaning of immortality, but I had been wrong. The routine had helped. At first I had thought it was torture, but the sameness helped keep me sane throughout the aeons. It had actually made time go faster. When I tried to rebel in little ways, like making the flowers in the biopond arrange in more and more elaborate ways, it had been interesting at first. However, over time, it had been more and more torturous, especially as I ran out of things to do. I tried to stick a balance between the ease of repetition and the need to become something more. It had made time go by slower, but it had still been worth it. The quality of my life was not simply measured in longevity, but its quality. The corporation had tried to structure most of my time, but after the first 10 years or so, I discovered many methods that would allow me to bypass their elaborate schedule when I wanted to. After 100 years, I'd overridden all the security codes to the point that the mastery of the station had been completely mine. So now I just sat waiting for the ship. I could see it on the sensors. I was tempted to call up my replacement and talk to him. My fortune was so enormous at this point that I could easily afford whatever pittance the company would dock me, assuming I didn't just override the sensors. But the truth was that I was somewhat apprehensive about meeting a new face. I had been alone for 1,000 years. It is difficult to describe just how long that can be, especially when you had only been 18 at the time. I was sane, but only barely. The ship continued decelerating towards the station. It was the most dangerous part of the job, since 3 or 4 beacons had been hit by a ship as it approached. I continued to prepare the shuttlecraft. I looked at my meager possessions. While it had been true I could buy most anything I wanted back home, there did not seem to be much point to it all. There were a few homemade things I could have made with the nanofabricator, but they had more of an intrinsic value to me than any kind of monetary one. After an eternity, the ship's shuttle eventually undocked. Technically, I was supposed to undock at the same time and head to the ship to maintain maximum efficiency. Why the company felt the need to preserve a few minutes of time when the trip took back years was something I never understood. My predecessor had cheated. He went EVA from his shuttle and boarded mine. He explained in explicit detail some of the finer points of the station, including the things that the corporation didn't want you to know. The main thing he did was help me unload, as though I could tell he really just wanted to see someone else. It was 10 years back, and he really didn't want to have to wait that long to talk to another human being. Neither did I. 10 years in the future. "So yes, you here to get yourself frozen?" the man asked, scratching himself. I wasn't sure if he'd bathed in over a month. Then again, with the right cyclants, he could have been in here for a lot longer than that and barely only begun to smell. The thought was not pleasant. Perhaps I should choose another place to sleep. There were better places, far better places, and I could certainly afford them. But none of them would be so close to her. "Yes, I'm here to be frozen." "That'll be 4,300 hours. That's pretty cheap," I said, rather surprised. "Law of supply and demand. There's like zero demand, especially in the bargain basement freezing in this part of the city, and a whole lot of supply. Government makes us keep this place open, so we comply. Anyone has the right to be frozen. It's the law." "Right. Can't have anyone doing themselves in," he chuckled. "No, I suppose not. Meet the Grim Reaper, he chuckled. "Can we just get on with this?" I asked. "Buying the farm. Are you quite through? Embracing their inner corpse." It was at this point that I left with the indignant, "What? Hey, come back here. I was just kidding," behind me. I kept walking. 10 years ago. He seemed innocent enough. He was older than I was, at least according to the file. He was more like 500, and his name was Joshua. "Hi," I said awkwardly. Even speaking at all used muscles I had forgotten how to use. "Hey, bud, how's it going?" Good. "Must be anxious to get out of here," Joshua said amiably. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 10 years. It had to be difficult for him. I knew. I'd been there. "Yes, I am anxious to get back." "I heard it's a bit of a shock for beacon workers. They have some kind of program to help you readjust." "Yes," I said. "It usually takes a year." "You mean you have to take 10 years to go back and then another year on top of that before you're free of the corp?" "That I do," I smiled grimly. It sounded so much better when it was someone else's pity than besides my own. "Well, that sucks." Yes, but I've got someone waiting." "Really? Wow. How'd you meet her? That crazy corp only let us send a letter once a month." "I knew her before." "Really? Wow, good for you. If she waits that long, I'm sure she'll wait another 11 years. "I reckon so, yes," I smiled. "Good luck," he said, as I headed for the shuttle and head back. "Good luck yourself. Good luck yourself." He was going to need it. How anyone could survive beacon work without something to wait for at the end was entirely beyond me. 10 years later. I found a better place to store myself. I hadn't really used any of the money I'd earned so far except to bribe the right people for access to Giroux. This place had all of the comforts of home. It was actually kind of creepy. I got my own room for 1,000 years. Not that bad. There was a ceremonial set of viewing chairs in case any loved ones would want to stare at my face while I was unconscious. That bothered me. I had family. We kept in touch. Still, family wasn't the same as what it had been. It was still the mostly stable relationships, but since it was now possible to have ties of blood that were alive and kicking 7 generations back, reunions often became more of a millennial event. There were exceptions, but they were rare. I told them to keep the chairs out of the room. No one but the designated technicians were to be allowed in there. Money talks. If I hadn't had such a broken heart, I might have been tempted to stick around and see what I could do with it. I knew it was cheap. It had been. I still believe. An incredible act of willpower and love to wait 1,000 years for love. It was an inexcusable act of cowardice to skip another from pain. Yet I was doing it anyway. The world had become something of a solephist's proxy for me. I could not connect to it and remain whole. I had lost a chunk of my life through time for another. I needed a way to get it back again, which is, of course, why I realized what a complete idiot I was, being approximately 10 seconds after the chamber door shut. There are some things that can never be taken back, no matter how much one might regret them. To surrender without taking at least a chance at these possibilities, without taking life in its supremacy in every waking moment, was a crime. I could almost understand the government's irrational actions at that point. There, at the brink of false death, I understood what life truly was. Every moment of 1,000 years had been priceless because I had lived it for love, to be loved. It was pure in a way nothing else could be. This was just a cheap cop-out, and it was too late to do anything about it. 1,000 years later. The lid of the chamber door opened up. My first reaction was to the cold. I felt as if every ounce of life had been sucked out of my body and then suddenly forcibly thrust back in. I was barely cognizant of who I was for a moment, but then the memories came rushing back immediately. Dozens of drugs, all working in tangent as they made their way through my system, repaired damaged tissue and neural pathways. Inside of a few minutes, I was cognizant of who I was and what had happened. There were no happy endings here. Giroux was still out there somewhere, at least unless the unthinkable had happened, but I was a distant memory in her mind. It was time to start over. I was amazed at the fact that I was able to stretch my muscles so quickly. Usually it took several days to recover from hibernation that long. Then again, I guess there had been a few changes since I was away. I sat up and looked around. To my shock, Giroux was there grinning at me. "You changed your mind?" I said. My throat was parched, but it was only a little. "Yes, I did." "Did you really think I would forget our letters so easily? Did you even check your email once before you went and tried to freeze yourself?" I blinked. I didn't. Why? "Because if you had, you would have read the tearful letter of apology I spent several hours trying to write. I had no other way of contacting you, so I wrote the letter. I explained that I was simply overwhelmed at what you had done to try and meet me, but of course I wanted to give a try. What girl wouldn't? You're quite handsome, you know. I knew you were intelligent and caring, but I never really looked at you before. Your older pictures don't do you justice." I was speechless. This had become some kind of fever dream from the hibernation. I had failed. I did not deserve a happy ending, not after my cowardly retreat. She continued, "I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that I love you, but you are hopelessly incompetent in financial matters. So I had lost my fortune while I slept? I had her. Who cared? All that mattered was now. The next time you sleep for 1,000 years, when you can afford to, buy the company looking after you. They will work harder at it. The good news is that I bought it instead. I hadn't even thought about that," I said. "I know," she smiled and hugged me. "The better news is that you didn't sleep for 1,000 years. You slept for 4 days, just long enough for the paperwork to go through." 10,000 years later. We had seen 1,000 worlds, and we would see 1,000 more. Each moment we spent with each other was better than the last. We inspired others to do the same. Once they saw that such a thing was possible, they began to follow suit. Not many succeeded, but they tried. Perhaps we did better because we paid such a price for our love. I don't know. I don't believe all love must be built on pain. What I do know is that there are those who say that love is all you need. They are right. Money doesn't hurt, though. I will say that of the Swamp Castle stories that I've read so far, that is definitely the best one. I'm going to rate that one an A-. It does still need some tweaking. If I was to rewrite the same story, I would include more details. Frankly, the concept behind this and the detail I put into it was really more novella length. But, I mean, this is what a short story is supposed to be. It's got a character, well, 2 characters. It's got, it doesn't do exposition dump. It's got a very clear idea, which is what are the consequences for a society when true immortality hits. And that is some of my best science fiction, right? I think things differently and do things differently. I've read stories about hibernation and immortality, but in my opinion, they very rarely address the true changes. I think one of the few I've read that does understand the consequences for immortality is Altered Carbon. But even that doesn't explore every angle about what such changes would make. And this is the equivalent, in my opinion, of Romeo and Juliet, but not as dark an ending. By the way, I'm kind of done to death with Romeo and Juliet. Don't even ask me why. But I will say that reading this again, there's some really dystopian elements that I hadn't realized that were in this story. The government is insanely dark in this. Just to be clear, I am not a fan of governments that oppose assisted suicide. I think that people have the right to die as long as they are not literally insane. And I do think that there need to be a lot of safeguards to that. But the idea of the government literally being able to force you to be alive is just dark to me. And, you know, you talk about government overreach. That's about as much of an overreach and a breach of your very being as there is. and especially in a society with immortality, that becomes much more important. It's not the government's place to tell people who they are. And, you can agree or disagree on the strength of government, but if you believe in the sanctity of soul and mind and life, or what I call the sacred subjective, then the idea of a larger power imposing its will on you that you did not agree to, especially to define your whole being, is just an act of evil that there are very, very few things that I would call more evil. There are a handful, but not many. Anyway, I liked this story. This story alone, going back and finding out about it, to me justifies the entire series.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!